Hi, welcome to the Dumps, the place for all your side needs. Now, you might be wondering, why is there such awkward silence? Why is everything so weird? Well, it's because it's one of those awkward solo episodes. So get excited. I'm going to be talking about two movies today. The Deer Hunter and Crumb. Now, do you think there's any correlation between these two things? No, absolutely not. They are unrelated, and to be honest, this is not what I planned for the episode. What I planned was something entirely different, but that required a lot more coordination with the two guests. Yeah, that's right, it was the first two guest episode, but we couldn't get the timing right due to different time zones and also poor timing as well. So for now, you're getting this, I guess. And if you're thinking, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, this is one of those random ones. It's kind of like one of my other episodes where it's just two random things that I recently watched. I didn't plan to talk about it in a podcast form, but I thought it'd be interesting since I didn't review one of these, and the one I did review, not many people saw. Not many people will probably watch this episode, but I do want to talk about it because I really care, or at least am interested in both of these. I did not have much prepared, so this is going to be a much more quicker episode. We have The Deer Hunter, 1978, the 1979 Best Picture winner for the Oscars, if that even means anything anymore. But yeah, this is one of those war movies. It's one of the acclaimed movies that II Space really likes. Well, actually, no, the wrong person, but you get what I'm saying, right? Love war movies, by the way. Love them. But yeah, unironically, this is one of those war movies where I'm kind of lost the impact of it, because the main thing about this one is it's one of the first Vietnam War related films. This is around when people start to finally understand the ramifications, or lack thereof, of the Vietnam War. And this was the first film to directly explore that topic, because no one had the guts to do it, but Michael Cimino did, the director who also did Heaven's Gate. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent on Heaven's Gate because this is a very, let's say, controversial fucking production, because The Deer Hunter was so successful. In fact, this is one of the most successful films of 1978. Crazy to think about, because I don't think this would ever make as much money as it did back in the day. Because the budget was like $15 million. And it made back $49 million. But if you adjust inflation, let's just say that's a lot of fucking money for its time. And so, after that movie got greenlit, Michael Cimino had this 1971 script in hand. It was Heaven's Gate, but it was originally called something else. Like, it was just a really long, absurd title. But yeah, that was, it was made to be, I guess, his passion project. By which I mean it was a nightmare. It was an utter nightmare. Because the movie did, in fact, release. But you see, it was only in theaters for 2 weeks. It had its premiere, but it was pulled from theaters in just 1 or 2 weeks. Now you might be thinking, why could that be? Well, in the previous production, the Deer Hunter, it was originally gonna be, had a smaller budget, but that 15 million, that was over budget, and it went over schedule, but that ended up being fine, because it ended up being such a success that that people could just ignore that, right? It could be ignored because, yeah, it won Best Picture. No one really understood how film productions went behind the scenes because, you didn't have as much physical media. I don't think VHSs were around that time. At least they weren't booming around that time because that was more of an 80s thing. And so, there wasn't any behind the scenes documentaries to understand where that came from. While, yeah, the script for The Deer Hunter originally came from some other people, Louis A. Garfinkel and Quinn K. Rectier. They sold that script, but, Michael Cimino got all the credit and made it his own. And, this was around the time where auteur driven, like Hollywood productions, wouldn't be crazy to think about. And, it was a sizably interesting movie. And, it was the first of its time. It was such a landmark that when you get to Heaven's Gate, you're kind of baffled. While yes, it was ambitious, it was just too ambitious. Because you had an initial $11 million. That increased to 33, like 30 or 33 million. That's unbelievable. Do you realize how bad that is? You have to be so over budget. Let me see the exact number. Yeah, it was. Oh wait, no, it wasn't 33 million. It was 44 million. My mistake. And you might be thinking, oh, in that 2 weeks, did it make any bank? Nope, it made 3.5 million in total. Because it got released originally, then it got recut and re-released in the theaters, and then it was never shown again. That's how bad it was. It was so bad that it had a 1980 release in New York, and then a United States release in 1981, which you don't think that would happen, but it does, because it was so long and so boring, and it was so controversial. Now, I myself haven't seen the movie, but it's a very infamous movie because apparently 4 horses died in the production and other animal cruelty accusations were given towards it, and that caused a lot more safety uh, regulations in terms of how animals are used in films today. At least it's important in that way, not because they did it properly, but because they did it so badly that it caused laws to be regulated. And this was also sort of the death of the auteur-driven Hollywood productions. Because after that, it was the turn of the decade and things changed. It became a lot more commercial. Stuff like Transformers and 80s TV was a lot more prominent. TV in general was just booming, and then films in themselves were a lot more rad. You know, they were a lot more focused on those big budget things because, Star Wars and Jaws had introduced those big summer blockbusters. They defined the term summer blockbusters. And so when something like this was such an abysmal failure, but it wasn't just Heaven's Gate, it was just a line of these type of films like Al Pacino, he stars in this movie Cruising, that also flopped, and some other, auteur-driven films flopped. So it wasn't just Heaven's Gate, but it's one of the main reasons why Hollywood course corrected. And so, yeah, Heaven's Gate was, really, really bad. And, it was originally going to be 5 hours long. Now, work prints were, sent quickly to the executives, and, Cimino had blamed them for, quickly demanding, any sort of work, even though, Cimino quite literally changed the locks to the editing room just so he could cut it himself, just barely making it in time. And even before then, the production itself was, as I said, with the hellhole, with the animal abuse and cruelty. Then there was also the fact that he abuses powers over actors, supposedly, and also the fact that, some actors were just left to just be waited to be called for. That at one point, I think one of the actors just straight up worked on an entirely different movie in the meantime. That is unheard of. I don't know how that happened, but it did. It really did. Um, People comparing them to Ingmar Bergman, and Fellini and even Michelangelo saying that how confident Cimino was on making their money back, even though he quadrupled the budget somehow. Harvard didn't allow them to, shoot in like a specific place, and a major battleground scene would just not unfold in the same place. And apparently, Cimino made over 1.3 million feet of footage, 400,000 metres, nearly 220 hours of footage, and apparently it was to surpass Francis Ford Coppola's mark of the 1 million feet of footage for Apocalypse Now. So it was basically a petty competition to see who could make the longer movie, supposedly. But I was going back to the actor who left, but apparently John Hurt, who was in that movie, spent so long waiting around on the production that he just went to work on a David Lynch movie, The Elephant Man, which, oh hey, my other solo episode was on Lynch. Go check that one out. But yeah, that was just a small fraction of supposedly the disastrous production of this movie. And, that 5 hour cut was never going to be released, obviously. And, eventually, the director's cut apparently is now 219 minutes, which is still long as hell, but it's somewhat better. But that 5 hour cut and that work print cut were definitely not going to be released, and so they shrunk it to 3 hours, and it did terribly, as I've said before, and just a combination of all these things sort of ended Hollywood, or at least it was one of the elements that ended what was at that point that period of Hollywood. Meanwhile, The Deer Hunter was the main staple in starting like the turn of war movies, and also was a landmark in auteur-driven projects. And that just reminds me, I haven't even started talking about, the movie we're supposed to be talking about. So let's get to that. The Deer Hunter is a pretty simple movie because you have De Niro, you have Nikki and Michael, two best friends. They live in a trailer together, and but they work for I guess a manufacturing business, and all his buddies and friends are all like getting prepared for a wedding, and we just have a full-on hour of setting up all these characters, or at least the scenery around them, which is very important for later when there's a drastic turn. But yeah, we get to spend time with them drinking and talking to each other, establishing the relationship drama, because you have this love triangle between De Niro's character, Christopher Walken's character, Nikki, and Meryl Streep. And for a while, I don't know, it felt kind of dragged on for me, because the structure of the whole thing is like a 3-act play, where first act we're all in this contained environment, and then they're released onto the Vietnam War, which is just a nightmarish like middle chunk. It is some of the best, or at least some of the most horrifying images of war to this day. It's not in the it shows all this violence, but in the more psychological way, because they're forced to do all these things, and it's very horrifically shot. And then we're going back to the third act where they're sort of recouping and recollecting from their trauma in that war. Perfectly sound, perfectly structured, and it's probably the foundation for what further war movies became. Because war movies before were kind of these grandiose epics. There was a couple album outs like All Quiet on the Western Front or Paths of Glory, but this established the formula that something like Platoon would follow, or let's think of any other war movie that way. But it was probably the quintessential aspect that made it, I guess, interesting for people, because you had to go back and forth. But even though that structure sounds good in concept, when you're stretching that for 3 hours, I think it gets repetitive, because you have all these like preparation sequences where they're all getting ready for the wedding. Like, yeah, I get it. These guys are rowdy. They're the working class men. We get it. And then the wedding scene is even more longer. And there's a couple of really good splices of moments in there. Like De Niro gets naked and drunkenly just walks around with his bare ass out in the open, which is really funny, but at the same time communicating how careless he was, or how demented he was at that point, and how later that would just get spin on its head. Then there's a moment where an actual war veteran visits the wedding, and he's just quiet. He doesn't speak of the grandiose tales of war and the myths of like what's going on out there. He just chugs along, and he even agrees with them, saying, "Hey, they're greeting him, they're insulting him," and he just goes along with it as if he's just a robot at that point, as if he can't even speak of it because it'd feel like it'd bring back bad memories. And there's something interesting about all that. And then there's one particular moment near the beginning where De Niro looks up and thinks of some sort of spirit, this like wolf. I forget the exact quote, but that there's something above there looking out for him, and there's like this myth. And that is completely shattered in the second act, as I said, that depicts all the war aspects of the movie. It has the iconic Russian roulette sequence, and it's probably what most people know the movie for because it is such an iconic sequence, and it's also some of the most horrifying stuff in the entire movie because you are set up to this very interesting aspect because you're instantly thrown into this. You have De Niro like fire torturing like everyone, and even though he is like winning at this point, it feels brutal because the fire, like the way it's all colorized and lit, feels so dark, as if it's this enveloping darkness. And he doesn't win every single aspect of it because, you know, they do one of the Viet Congs, they like throw a bomb inside a basement full of citizens or villagers, and they all explode, limbs shooting across. And De Niro just kind of moves forward with that, only focusing on one who survived, a woman and their child. And so he tries to, burn the guy who did all this. But it's too late because they're already shot and probably most likely dead. And then heroically, all these helicopters come in. But then you realize, oh, hey, there's these other helicopters with these bombs. And then there's also a march of people. And you're getting confused as to whose side. But then you just kind of end up being like, oh yeah, wait, no, they get captured. And they're completely fucked. And they're all trapped. They have no power. A couple of them are, basically swimming in their own jail under the base where, every amount of the murder is happening. And there's an even worser fate where there's this drowning area, the pit, or like this like cage where there's a bunch of rats in there and corpses that have been rotting in there since most of the people who entered there drowned, and so you're kind of left waiting for each of them to be lifted up and thrown into a Russian roulette match. And this is where we get a bit iffy on things because I think I liked this initially because I thought, okay, so the Vietnamese, they're portrayed as basically brutes who you can barely understand a dialogue of. Because, from us, we're in the perspective of these soldiers who are just having to deal with their games. And, De Niro basically just keeps on telling, his friends to hold out, to keep going. And then one of his friends, he does survive, but he does break the rules by shooting the gun onto the roof because he knew, there was a bullet in there, and he tried to save himself. But by saving himself, he enters into the cage. And then when De Niro's character goes back down under the home, he tells Christopher Walken's character Nick, he was just like, okay, the other dude, he's a lost cause. We got to keep going. And you're thinking, oh my god, like, that's brutal. Like, yeah, later he does save him from that trap, and he does have empathy towards him, but he's willing to do it if they have to. If they have to do it, then they're going to have to do it. And that's how much it's affected on him and how careless he is about it. And then there's the fact that he just has faith in it. He has faith in everything that is going to go right. But if he has to take realistic chances, then he will take realistic chances, which is what makes that line so important. Then they go back up, and there's the iconic scene, and the way everything's lit is basically filled with darkness. Like, you can recognize these two guys, and they're both terrified of whether or not they will get killed. But, they are planning something out. And then, the Vietnamese are just in the shadows, and we can barely even recognize them or see them as human, as if they're just some sort of monsters. And, at first I'm thinking, okay, they'll turn that around and give some empathy, since this movie definitely shows a lot of empathy towards the meaninglessness of the Vietnam War and how useless it really was, and how both sides could be just miscommunicate, obviously. But I'll get into that later. But, that whole sequence works so well. And then them having to, break everyone out and getting what's left and having to just slowly, like, swim through this river on, like, a branch. And then the helicopter tries to save them and then separates them. Leaves me thinking, oh, that's it? And that's weird to me because, the most iconic sequences in this movie are the fact that, there's guns, there's the chance, most likely, of death. But when you survive all that, what's really left to think about? And there's this just heartbreaking scene where just Nick forgets everything. He disassociates from this war because when they call out his name, he's just befuddled. He can barely even speak. And then later, he just starts doing the Russian roulette thing again, but making it basically his whole life, going around doing games. He doesn't even understand, the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese take him along, drive him around, doing games, risking his life. And he gets lost in the shuffle while, De Niro's character brings back the other dude who he thought would be killed, saves him, never sees him again, and tries to search for Nick, only to fail, but to regrettably go home. Almost as if he doesn't want to go home, as if, like, the war is his home. Because at first he just doesn't tell anyone that he's home, even though they had a whole celebration planned. And then later he comes in, trying to swoon in with Meryl Streep. But even that's not the same, and things will never be the same, no matter what. And the film depicts this as depressing as possible, and it gets all the main aspects down. But I just think it's too long, because there's just a lot of scenes of being sad, being also very sad, but there's not enough interesting dialogue or action to go along with that. Like, yeah, De Niro's character is sad, and he doesn't say anything because, he doesn't want to speak of it. But the way he interacts with the rest of the world doesn't feel as impactful as it should, because, yeah, he's closed off, that's the whole point, but he never says anything about it. And none of the other characters say anything interesting to spark anything out of that. It's sort of just kind of a mood piece, and that's kind of the main problem. Just way too long, and it carries a lot of this weight, but it never lifts it off his shoulders. It never lets it play out. And what limited nature we get out of it, there's some really, really awesome stuff in this movie. I like the way it uses nature as a way to show how basic and brutal it is, and how there's so much more complexion to the trees, to the surroundings, but it rather looms in darkness and would rather look to the sky as if it's just some sort of landscape, that there's nothing human here, but there is. There's deer, but all you're told is to do the one shot, just as is Russian roulette. Just taking a risk and making that shot. And that's what's most important when, dealing with that. Because, there's a sort of meaninglessness to it, and just to keep going, to keep doing this thing, because it's a natural survival instinct. But do you understand that? Maybe the deer is innocent. Maybe it's always been innocent because because a deer's made for food, or at least that's how we view it, because that's how you have to survive. And that single thing is brilliant. But the whole film is only like scattered with these things. It's not entirely made of these things. I did read into it, and apparently the writers did no research into like the Vietnam War anyway, so I don't know. I'm conflicted between these, whether or not I truly think this is a great movie or not, because I don't know. You have this perspective where it's like, oh my god, I've been exposed to this truly horrific war. Now let's all get together and sing patriot songs, like near the ending, which I'll mention later, where I'm conflicted on that. And I don't know. I guess you could view that ending as more of a communal thing, which I think that's what the directors describe it as. But I don't know, the way it's done is weird, and I'll get more into it later. But earlier into the film, like I said, they just depict these, like, the Viet Cong as just some sort of demons when there's nothing human about them, and it feels like a very close-minded film, which is exploring the nature of the American, rather than exploring like why this conflict was started in the first place, but rather focusing on the psychological impact, which is both a good and bad thing because it lets us focus on the psychological impact, and that's important. But is it the most well done at it? No. And is it kind of close-minded because we have these like close-knit Americans who live in this like specific area of town where they don't acknowledge these certain things, and when they do, they just never do. And I guess being closed off makes it more subtle, but at the same time, it makes it feel more empty and kind of hollow. So, yeah. It like goes back and forth for me, which is why I have it at like a 7 with no heart, because I'm just so confused on whether or not the intentions of the film were great or not. And I'm pretty sure like veterans and some Viet Cong even protested the film by saying it was all lies, and the script did have to back it up because apparently it was made in a month and it was revised so many times, and was based off of just a draft, and they didn't really think about it all too much. And it's kind of a miracle that this film even garnered the attention it got. So, yeah, I mean, it's a good movie, but I don't think it's the greatest thing in the world. And the fact that it portrays Vietnamese people as brutes and nothing more does hinder my enjoyment a bit, because there's just this oddness to it that they can't really make sense of it. And when everyone comes together in the end, I think there could have been a lot more, but instead it's weird. I don't know, people like the ending. I personally don't really that much, because you're just sitting around, it's like, oh, they're all sad. Nick's dead after he just constantly like roped himself into Russian roulette bets because he couldn't live with himself anymore. And then they just sing God Bless America. Like, yeah, this anti-American movie ends with the most celebratory American thing. And you think, oh, it's a personal thing, not literally meaning America, but they sing all the liberty stuff, and the way it's framed is as if it's not just a group of people singing closely together, but this wide shot of everyone singing. It's not like going around seeing all the personal feelings of their facial expressions or anything. It's kind of emotionless, where it's like, God bless America, we did it, boys. Is it ironic? I can't tell, because it's feels like it's trying to be bittersweet, and then the end credits make it even more weirder, because it's like one of those cheesy, like they're showing footage of the dudes and then freeze framing, and when they're like smiling or shit, it feels like a juxtaposition that doesn't feel intentional and doesn't really try to say anything, and is more or less just that. I don't get it. I don't get what this is doing. Why would you do this? This doesn't make any sense to me. And yeah, I don't know. It really likes to show just a lot of things, but it just never. It only scatters bits of meaning into it. Not that it's like a bad movie or anything, but I just wish it was more based on its reputation and for the fact that it won Best Picture. But I feel like it only won Best Picture because it was the first Vietnam, like the first truly Vietnam film that depicted it in an actually realistic way. So yeah, I guess it's important in that way, but I wouldn't say it's like the greatest of Vietnam films. And I haven't explored that territory as much. But yeah, compared to other ones I've watched, I just can see why it's only remembered for certain iconic things, because it only does have certain iconic things to it. And plus, it's overshadowed by a director who, you know, lost his mind with Heaven's Gate and lost his entire career chance. Like, he could have been like the next big director, but no, he's like he people only remember him for Heaven's Gate and for the cult following it has now, not for his actually great stuff. And he probably could have directed more, but after Heaven's Gate, there was no chance he could have made something as impactful as Deer Hunter, or might have even been more impactful than Deer Hunter. And we could have gone there eventually, but yeah. And so, I guess we're going to be talking about Crumb, which I'll talk less of. But Crumb is a documentary on, well, the creator of Fritz the Cat. Now, if you're familiar with me, or really one of the videos on this podcast, I'm a big Bakshi head, and I love the adaptation of Fritz the Cat that he did. But Crumb doesn't think so, and this movie kind of explains a lot why. He's a very disturbed man. He's a very, let's say, eccentric man, because he basically grew up in a family that forced him to draw, that forced him to feel this way, and made him feel isolated. Because his brothers and his cousins they were all company to each other, to a point where Crumb could only communicate through art. Because throughout, you just let these conversations play out, sometimes a bit too much, but it allows some sort of naturalism to it and gives a lot more context as to why his work is the way it is. Now, I think that he's not a very great person, but he's probably one of the, or if not the most important underground artist of all time. And so it's complicated because, I don't think he was necessarily can be excused for all his actions because of this empathetic way we look at him. Rather, the film allows you to take in how he reacts to certain things, which makes it feel a lot more empathetic and more personal, while at the same time accessible, because you understand, hey, I grew up in a world like this, or, oh, I can imagine how I'd interpret it that way. Because, he saw a lot of things, but he never really socialized with those things. Like women, he views women with this honest beauty, but at the same time, he doesn't really know these women, and sometimes he can get really exploitive. There's this one moment where they explain how he made this one comic parodiizing like 50s families aesthetics. But the main thing is the plot is basically it's softcore porn. It's hardcore porn, actually. It's a hardcore incest porn. No joke. It's just hardcore incest porn. And you might be thinking, huh? What? What are you talking about? And it's meant to satirize how closely knit these families are, but also, it allows the critics to say on the matter of this specific comic and how it's like, I mean, yeah, but you didn't need to go that extreme. But that's how just fucked up Crumb is, that he can just think this and think, yeah, this is reasonable, this makes sense, and definitely isn't disturbing in the slightest, and you just kind of learn to accept that. In fact, the way he sexualizes things is a major part of the film, as we encounter many ways people interpret the way he sexualizes things. Because, one of them is like, he showed my true fatness, but it didn't make me feel ugly, but it made me feel more proud of myself. And, that's cool. And then there's other people who are talking about, the incest family comic and thinking, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why would you do this? This is a heinous man who fetishizes bodies. You can think of it in multiple ways because, Crumb is a very disassociated individual with people who have failed in their own lives and have projected onto him because his brother was also a comic artist and he drew hundreds of comics and even had this whole comic that eventually just turned into scribbles and words. No, but yeah, the words turned into scribbles to a point where no one could read it, not even his own brother who wrote the damn thing could not even read the whole thing because it just became so tiny that you couldn't even tell what the hell it was saying. And that's how much failure there really was, I guess, because when you're dealing with a man who had a family that enforced these ideals on him, one who wanted to be a comic artist but never really grew out of it, and eventually after this film's production, that brother killed himself. He just killed himself, and that makes him more sickly dark, but it kind of fits into the whole narrative that the film was trying to construct from a more empathetic way. And also, another thing, I Lynch somehow connects here again. David Lynch is the one who's presenting this documentary because he produced it apparently. So yeah, I made two Lynch connections on on this solo episode, which is connected to another solo episode about Lynch. That's confusing, but yeah, this documentary definitely just tries its best with the material it has, but it leaves it a bit too stretched out, a bit too thin. It did not need to be as long as it was. I forgot that how long it was, but yeah, it's 2 hours. And I don't think it needed to be. It could have been just an hour and 40. Cause there's some dialogue scenes where, he goes on about his love life with his former wife and how he was just caught just hanging out and cheating on her, but they just kept going on with the relationship. Because Crumb, I think he does really love this woman from clear, gestures and his way of speaking to her, but also he is a very sex addictive freak who, yeah, he can see beauty in everything, but also can be just heinous because he grew in a world of violence and, he was the odd one out in, his school. Because his school, he wasn't like the unpopular kid, but he was more of the he's in the background kid. Because people did admire him for his drawings, but they never really understood where he was. It was never in that popular crowd. Meanwhile, his brother was just bullied constantly and couldn't feel like he was right in. And then Crumb himself was just such a nerd, and he looked like a nerd ever since he was like in his teen years, and no one really cared for him besides his art, and so he just kept going with his art, and that's his only way of showing feelings. And I just find it interesting how that just reflects with each other, and I explained this in my review, like exactly what I'm saying, but I really wanted to sort of go more into detail on it here because it's just fascinating to me that that his life is just like this, and I couldn't believe it myself because I thought this would be just a very straightforward documentary about him and just him, but I think you kind of need to know the culture around him and the city he lived in order to understand Crumb, or at least piece together what was Crumb and who he was. And he was a man who had true artistic intentions. It's no wonder why he wanted to be close with the Fritz the Cat movie adaptation production, but then when he didn't, and when Bakshi did his own thing, he just dismissed it entirely, even though it had good intentions and is a great movie. Crumb didn't see it that way because it's not him. It's not entirely him, and whatever Crumb is weird fellow, just a strange fellow. And yeah, I really just wanted an excuse to talk more about Bakshi shit, because I find it fascinating that Crumb just completely hated this project. But mainly it was the producer's fault, because the producer of Fritz the Cat movie, he basically bought the rights to the Fritz the Cat thing, because initially Bakshi worked closely with Crumb. Crumb even handed a sketchbook in order to help him, I guess, replicate the style of Fritz the Cat, which it did work out. But then eventually he grew more distance towards the project, and then, the producers took a hold of it. And then eventually Bakshi was backstabbed, because after that was a big success and he went on to do other stuff, they used the property to make an entirely different thing not related to Crumb nor Bakshi, which is 9 Lines of Fritz the Cat. So, yay. It's not really Bakshi's fault, although Crumb probably thinks it is, in his own mind at least. And yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy, man. Oh my god. The fact that Bakshi just was able to make that movie is crazy. And even if it was a success, Crumb just refused to acknowledge it, even in this own movie. Because you'd think you'd hear something, and you'd hear in the beginning where he just straight up, like, fucking middle fingers it, or just, like, insults it entirely during, like, one of the first opening 15 minutes where he's, like, doing a presentation with people. Which I think is just funny. I honestly prefer it this way, because it allows us to get more personal with him, while also still including his art. Because there's a couple of, like, montage scenes where they're showing his, like, nude art, his clay art, which is like the opening credits, and then there's also the other art that they show in art shows, and people looking at it. It's great, and I'm glad like this was also in the Criterion Collection. I didn't expect that, but I guess it is. And if you want to see either of these movies, they're Deer Hunter is on Netflix, and Crumb is on Tubi, so you should go check those out. And mostly, I've been here just to spotlight aspects I like, and aspects I don't really like as much about these two pretty good movies. On here, I don't just talk about what I love and what's new to me, but also just things I watch in general, and I hope you've been able to get personal insight into how I view these two movies. I do appreciate one of them, and I do really like one of them, but they are very flawed in their own ways. As for the next week, this week was meant to be, what the big event was, but, this week we're really going to be a bit more chill. And I hope you enjoyed that. And I don't really have any more to say, but I'm just going to keep talking and 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 talking.